Hi, this is Phyllis with another episode of my podcast series, Second Win. It's been about 2 weeks, and I've been very busy and just decided it's time to give you an update. I'm busy working on preparing for the Southern California Women's Health Conference. We had a creative writing meeting, and it was a chance to bring together some ideas as well as some final thoughts on my trilogy, SHEBA Ghost Ship. So let's get started with this. September 1st, the agenda will be talking about Up and Rising, two stories, some perspectives, personal and others, family stories, as well as history, the facts, looking at the past, the present, and our future, and some solutions. And I put these two numbers in. If you look at my white cursor, you see 2 plus 2 is 4 for most people. 2 plus 3 is 5. So the only way to change the outcome is to change one of the variables. And otherwise, it's a form of insanity. So we do have to make some changes. This is a reference to my book for my PhD program, Changes. So the only way to change the outcome is to change one of these numbers. So if we change this second variable from 2 to 5, the outcome will be 7. If we change this first variable to 1, this outcome will be 4. So this is a graphic illustration of the term or the comment that you've heard from people. If you keep doing the same thing over and over, you'll get the same outcome, and it's a bit crazy. So I won't make any more references to what we are seeing in the news, but I will continue moving forward. We'll summarize and look at some questions. So SHEBA Ghost Ship talks about the phantom ships, the ships that are cursed to roam the sea. But my story is a version that deals with African American people of color who've been linked to the oceans. So I discovered in some research two SHEBA Ghost ships that relate to this story. The Ile de France, first arriving in England in 1945. It was a luxury liner that was recommissioned and used to transport the troops during World War II, including the African American females. That's why I have this logo, African American women soldiers. So, in World War II, the second is the Queen Elizabeth, also used in World War II. They used two ships to transport the African American females on their journey. So I'll go back to the first slide because I'm not sure if the sound came through. This is the latest episode of my Second Wind series on YouTube. We're covering uprisings, perspectives, present, past, and future in case there were some technical difficulties. If we change one number in this formula, that's the only way to change the outcome. And that's what the troops saw, the African American troops and others who fought for freedom on other shores. They had to make some changes here at home to get a different result. And I'm paying homage and honor to their determination and the results, the way they made these changes. So 2 plus 2 is 4. They made a change to some variables like abolishing some legal discriminations and Jim Crow. We change that to 5. We come up with an outcome 7. So the job isn't finished. That's why I've got question marks. So let's go back. There were two ships used to carry the African American females. So we're talking about the problems here: transportation, legal, institutional barriers that held people back from meeting their fullest potential. The issue in World War II, in February 1945, the warehouses in Birmingham, England were filled to the ceiling with millions of mail that was not yet delivered to the U.S. troops. They estimate in this slide 7 million, most likely 2 to 3 times more, that the military, the government, Red Cross workers that were all serving in the European theater. Airplane hangars held undelivered Christmas packages. On and on. You can read this on your own as the forces drove across Europe, ever-changing locations that also interfered with the mail delivery. So the issue is to get the mail through. Many personnel shared common names, which I encountered in my audits and reviews, such as Medicare, Smiths, Jones, also many other names are common, and it can be confusing. So service members noted that they weren't getting any mail, and it was causing an issue of morale. 6 months was estimated the time to solve the problem. And what happened was the African American females, including my aunt Anne, were called up. They were trained and sent first to England, then to France to clear this up. So I'm jumping to one of the marches in May of 1945. I show this as the women are marching, the African American females serving in World War II that I never learned about, although my Aunt Anne often showed very strong emotional reactions whenever she tried to share with us her history and her research. I can see why, because they weren't allowed to carry weapons in this march. This was a march in honor of Joan of Arc, who was burned at the stake, and her picture is at the first pages of my first book for my PhD to show readers what has been done to try to stop and crush female leadership. But I'm so glad to see these women marching in honor of Joan of Arc in France during World War II. So it says Major Adams arranged for them to have jiu-jitsu trainers just to manage the onlookers. In July 1945, 3 of these WACs were killed in a Jeep accident. They were buried in decorated wooden coffins, and 3 are buried at Normandy near the D-Day beaches, which again I never knew, and it's the 6888. August 1945, the war was over. My father served in the Pacific, and his sister, Auntie Anne, was in Europe. And this is the timeline that you can review again at your leisure. But what I want to show you again, what these WACs had to endure in the United States before they even were sent overseas. It was barrier breaking to get them even recruited. I understand that 800 were sent, a small number. They said it was to represent a 10 percentage point representation of the population, but I think there was a lot more going on. But 4 black WACs were participating in a strike at Fort Devens in Massachusetts. They opted to take a court martial rather than to accept discriminatory work assignments. Police officers beat 3 black WACs in July 1945 for sitting in a waiting room designated for whites in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. Now, these were military officers, military members who were trained to fight for freedom, being beaten, being court-martialed. One was returned to Fort Knox. Another one was sent back to she was under Benjamin O. Davis's command, who defended them. And I remember my father used to speak very highly of Benjamin Davis. So this is part of a presentation that was done by a retired colonel. So I want to show you again, this relates to the SHEBA ghost ship in terms of a sighting, in terms of an eternal spirit that's protecting and representing the sacrifices made at sea and on land. So there were 2 carriers sent, which makes sense for safety, for security. While in New York, the war broke out. It was laid up in Staten Island. It was put on loan to the British Admiralty, stripped. Then it was loaded with 12,000 tons of water, materials, submarine oil tank shells, and several uncrated bombers. In March 1941, it departed for Europe. So again, these are some additional slides on what happened after the war. It was sold quietly to a Japanese scrapping company who sent it to the breakers. Basically, my understanding, it was crashed after being rented out for $4,000 a day as a floating movie prop for the disaster film. But on a highlight, back to the main subject, the creative writing exercise was to highlight a secondary character in addition to the number 1 protagonist. So again, it looks like we have at least 2 secondary carriers, which I'll name in a minute. The number 1 hero in my story is my Aunt Anne Chestang. She's my hero. We never knew her story. We know there were some things going on that caused some very emotional reactions. She tried tracing her history, and there just wasn't much information, but I'm filling in the blanks and presenting this here, where she served in Paris in World War II. I found her military records listed on a search on Ancestry.com. I also looked at the National Archives. So her birth name First name was Maggie. Middle name A for Ann. She was known as Auntie Ann. Race listed as Negro or Black, single at that time. She was a private, born in 1922, about the same year or a year after my father was born, because he referred to her as baby sister. Born in Mississippi, lived in San Francisco, which I've mentioned before, had graduated from high school 4 years, and she has her service number here, Branch Women's Army Corps, and that helps to connect the dots. And we show something else. The 6888 was unrecognized for nearly 80 years and now is only being remembered and honored. And these stories are not part of my history studies as a undergraduate, nor in graduate school or in my PhD studies. So I'm filling in these gaps by doing this brief episode of the SHEBA Ghost Ship and talking about the 6888. So I want to continue. This is another slide from the presentation by the retired colonel that I'll mention and give credit to, but I do see the listing of the military assignment orders, and I believe on one of these columns that I enlarged, I do believe I see my aunt's name listed, but this is one of the surviving. The orders weren't issued until March of 1945, and if you recall, I'll flip back, her enlistment date, my Auntie Anne's enlistment date was April 1944. So this is one of the pictures of her baby sister in her uniform heading to Europe. Baby Wiki, they called her. And that's one of her pictures. This is another picture of my Auntie Anne with one of her soldier associates keeping a close eye, sitting close as they made it through that European assignment. So I'm filling in my story, the fiction showing her additional protection, 2 Dobermans as she went on her routes, grenades that she threw back when she was under attack. There was not much information I could find on their actual assignments except that they worked 3 shifts, a triple shift, 24 hours. I've worked 2 shifts, that's 16 hours. They worked 3 shifts and they eliminated the backlog in half the time. So I'm in my story, she's encountering and she had her Dobermans. She threw back the grenades. This is a picture of her in civilian life. But during the war, my story entails my Auntie Anne and her encounter with the other hero of my story, Miss Josephine Baker, who renounced her citizenship, became a French citizen, and a global superstar. And when I presented it to the creative writing group, his first reaction was nude dancing, dancing naked. But Josephine Baker can be known for her humanitarian efforts. And this is one picture showing her giving out rations to the citizens of Paris. And in France, she was loved, honored. She adopted, I believe, 12 or 13 pictures, but she did start out as a dancer, dancing barely, clad with just a few jewels, and on this, her famous banana skirt. So in my story, Miss Josephine, they say during the war she left Paris. But my story, the secondary theme is how many ways can you peel a banana? So this is another peeling of these layers. These are pictures of Miss Josephine who helped support the French resistance in her uniform, also doing her dances as a celebrity and also part of the Folie Bergère Can-Can. So again, Auntie Anne made her transformation from the soldier to San Francisco to a teacher in her civilian dress. And so did Josephine Baker as a resistance fighter in her uniform, dancer, entertainer, and she was known. She kept a pet pig with her at all times. She also had a pet cheetah. So she made quite a few friends, and possibly a few people were against the fact that she denounced her citizenship. She did travel, but in encounters to the United States, there were some racist encounters that were mentioned in the press. But for my story, this is a contact of my Auntie Anne with the male corps. never before seen in this context. The story's never been told, so I'm filling in with some fiction. Fighting forces of evil here in the United States and in Europe, fighting the Nazis who were secretly outside, moving around, and the resistance fighters who kept them at bay and managed to suppress and crush as well as work along with the Allied forces. But Miss Baker, I understand, she was secretly moved to her castle outside of Paris during occupation. So Auntie Anne in my story had to grab the mail, make a secret passage, grab the flamethrower and blast them if she needed to get them Nazis and other enemies out of the bushes, and a friend driving the Jeep alongside just to make sure she made it safely. She threw grenades as she needed it. Some of her comrades' Jeep turned over, but Auntie Anne made it back safely. So, on this story, she goes to deliver some messages, some mail to the spy resistance fighter, Miss Josephine Baker, who had greetings with the resistance fighters, kept some at her house, and then taking a step further, she did choose to support the French resistance fighters who were along with the Allied side fighting the Nazi hateful genocidal maniacs. So, Miss Baker learned how to collect valuable information as a spy. Although she was under watch, she was waiting for the mail from Auntie Anne Chastain, chatting it up with the troops on both sides. I understand she entertained the troops and insisted on having integrated audiences. And I've seen pictures. If you watch this film, you'll see pictures of Miss Baker entertaining the troops that were integrated, even the ones that were laid up from the hospital. So we have Auntie Anne in the story too, in Europe, in France, working hard with the rest of the hard-working WACs, moving through the ranks, and I'm honoring them both. So that's why I included this story. I'm sure there are a lot of stories untold of movement, passing back and forth, and that's why I have this image of someone who's always on the move, always on the run, and always keeping both eyes forward as well as an eye out back, and with her backup security. So these were freedom fighters that Miss Baker and my Auntie Anne were helping to fight for their rights. They were fighting for their rights as human beings, for their freedom, for voting rights, to oppose oppression, and gifted Miss Baker in dance, movement, and singing. So Auntie Anne witnessed this World War, lived through these systems. She returned to the United States. Many questions were unexplained, but she did pass the message, the mail to Miss Baker. Everyone knew about the murders and violence, but there was often silence or nothing done in Mississippi and in the United States. But we're talking about the ghosts and the specters, honoring those heroes that made it possible for us, for me, to be here today. So there are many unanswered questions, many mysteries. So I found through my research pictures of the French resistance, this lady with her automatic machine gun on the left, other ladies and other soldiers in the resistance in World War II. So my French teacher, Sister Delia Louise, was honored with chaperoning us on our trip to Europe. That was a very lucky blessing I'll always be thankful for, but I can see why she was the authority, and she wanted to make sure we knew the story, and we made it to Paris for the 14 Juillet, French Independence March, and I can see again why. The fight for freedom, the fight for independence was a severe struggle. And these are pictures again of the French resistance fighters that Josephine Baker was helping to make sure that they were able to do what they had to do to gain their freedom. Here's another picture and a highlight of the man in his full gear with his weapons, and one of the French resistance fighters in shorts with her weapon and hat as well. So when you look at my book Shorts, you can remember this lady is an example of the shorts steam anthology in action during World War II. So my story, as I mentioned, she had to grab the flamethrower, get them out of the bushes, toss the grenades, and kick them aside. But there was no need because she always had backup. Their meeting, she passed the mail bags. Josephine's telling how she pasted small strips of information on the banana leaves, fashioned from the notes and envelopes and information that she managed to get from the Nazis as a spy who loved her dancing. Everyone in the audience loved her dancing, and the transmission of information is the key of our hero, Miss Josephine Baker, as well as my Auntie Anne, who were part of the heroic group of African American women who delivered the mail to the troops during a war. Josephine Baker sends a message via this messenger to fight and help win the war. So I found this beautiful picture of my auntie. Of course, it's going to always have my auntie in there somewhere, enjoying a drink, a little beverage on a break, and waving a beautiful greeting. I'm sure my Auntie Anne is over there too. But as I mentioned, I met another lady in military and she said, no pictures, please. So Auntie Anne might be somewhere in the shadows, but this is another picture of some of these 800 ladies that were glad enough to wave and smile. So the story showing again, I showed you the parade in honor of Joan of Arc, who was burned to death at the stake because they couldn't accept her leadership at age 16. The black female African American Negro soldiers during World War II took part in a parade, marched straight through the marketplace where Joan of Arc was burned. Here's another picture of the African American soldiers with Lester Walton, the envoy and minister in Liberia, West Africa. As I said, I'm filling in the blanks. My sister went to West Africa and she served as part of a program. I believe it was a precursor to the Peace Corps. And I can see, I found some other research showing why there was a connection in the open arms, the reception of her going to Liberia. I know the history. I know the efforts by Marcus Garvey and the government to repatriate ex-slaves. But I've learned again that the connection and continues up to the present. But this is an interesting picture from 1941 to 1945. I've also learned that several South African troops were sent to fight the war in Europe against the Nazis. But here's a beautiful picture I also found in my research in the archives. I'll call it Eggs for the Nazis. Two of the African American soldiers holding the bombs titled Easter eggs for Hitler. So you can focus on this and see the bright, wide smiles as they get ready to load these bombs, the missiles that they're sending to Hitler for Easter. And if you want to listen to the Egg Sucking Dog podcast, this might be a good time to listen to that and look at this picture as they're sending these bomb eggs to Hitler. Happy Easter, Adolf is written on one of them. So I found some other beautiful pictures. The Wax at Work in Washington, D.C., Harriet West and Irma Clayton. These names are popping up of people that I've met. Could be relatives. It might just be a coincidence, but I think it's a beautiful way to honor their work. Again, Wax at Work in Washington, D.C., the first Negro wax arrived, and here's a picture, 800 girls of the 6888 Central Postal Directory. The first to arrive in England, then when they managed to douse that emergency, the solution, working around the clock, then they went to France. And that's where, again, I see some traces and connections with my Auntie Anne's service. I found some other beautiful pictures quickly. Hospital apprentices, Ruth Isaacs, Catherine Horton, Inez Patterson, the first Negro waves to enter the hospital corps at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda. Again, these are beautiful pictures I'd never seen. I did more research and I found that even after they returned, the Army research was conducted, and this is a listing of several of the research topics from 1942 to 1945 at the National Archives. So if you want to spend more time, if I want to spend more time, I can look at these. One is titled The Negro Study, Attitude of and Towards Blacks, March 1943. Another one, The Shenango study, attitudes of AWOLs and others compared. Now, that must have been quite an interesting challenge because you can't speculate, but I'm sure April of 1943, a study of the AWOLs must have been quite an interesting pursuit. Two, three more I want to bring up. Post-war job plans of white officers and black and white EM, enlisted men, I believe. June 1944. Repeat. Post-war job plans of white officers and black and white EM, enlisted men. The next study, military police study, parens, attitudes of officers and enlisted men. March of 1944. And the last one, which is perfectly timed for this discussion, the neuropsychiatric study, the psychoneuroatric screening of March 1944. Sample size 958. The study of military police was about 5,000, and the post-war job plans had about 24,000. So again, I didn't know they even did that. It looks like there's plenty of data, but as I mentioned before, the WACs had issues of beatings, being on strike, putting in jail, even being sent to Europe. So someone asked as part of this exercise, why would they return? Why didn't they just stay over there? Well, this is a picture of destroyed, devastated Europe right after World War II. So as I mentioned during the creative writing exercise, it was between the devil and the deep blue sea. It's choice between this or going back to what they knew, which again, some people know what I'm talking about, the devil and the deep blue sea. So again, 80 years later, this is part of the story. The 6888 finally receiving honor and credit. Original documents were used for the research. Cold, dirty, rat-infested aircraft hangars, broken windows with blackout curtains to prevent enemy detection in their 24/7 hours. In Birmingham, they reduced it by 3 months. Then they moved on to France, where they did the parade where Joan of Arc was burned to death. So Colonel Edna did part of this research and created this movie, and I want to give her credit. This is also honoring the few, 6 or 7, of the black female WACs that served in the World War II and that are still alive. Miss Elizabeth Barker Johnson in Hickory, North Carolina, before and after. And I love seeing the pictures as they sent out in their 20s and now aging beautifully and gracefully, 70, 80 years. And it's never too late to give credit where credit's due. So I think I showed this slide again. This is a duplicate showing where they're buried in the Normandy D-Day near D-Day beaches. But again, I want to give reference and credit where credit's due, including Barnhill, J.H., scholarly journal reference, Glory in Their Spirit, how 4 black women took on the army during World War II, in the Historical Journal of Massachusetts. One of my other contacts asked about my sources, so I stay true to my academic training to cite and give credit where credit's due. There's a Russian journal that was listed. The interview that the colonel did was translated in Russian, and this I won't even dare to try, but this is a journal article that was cited and written in Russian about this study and the contributions of the black female WACs. The third by Merriman, 2020, Clipped Wings, The Rise and Fall of Women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II. And last, C.L. Neese, Stepping into the Open, Women Experiences in the Military During World War II, a doctoral dissertation in 2020. So there are a few references now. The movie I want to give credit to is titled The 6888, produced by James William Therese, and the producer is the Colonel. Edna W. Cummings, Elizabeth Helm, Malcolm Ross, and the others. So I want to give them credit. Also, my books refer to the change as the resistance as part of the change process, and we see the examples of the black female, African American females who served in World War II, who did their job but also resisted and fought when they thought things were needed to make some changes. So again, keep that in mind as you listen. Why green management? Why climate change? This is another question that's being answered through this research. After you see the utter devastation and destruction, you really have no other choice but to rebuild and hopefully build back better. We're in this COVID pandemic. We've had several crises lately, and I've seen that things intended for war, including the C 17, the project I worked on with Boeing, the C 130, I've seen in action in these past few weeks for peace, trying to rescue and help as far as humanitarian efforts. So that's some good positive note that I think I'll close and end this discussion for now. I have a part two coming up. Just hold on, and I'll have that ready in a minute. Again, as I mentioned, my Aunt Trace used to make reference to our family having roots in Martinique, having roots in the islands, and I found there is actually on St. Lucia and Chastenay, which again is my auntie's and middle name. The last name, Chastenay, I think is a version of our last name. And I even found some ship records through Ancestry.com showing ship travel between Martinique and the islands to New York, to the United States. So hold on for part two. The saga continues. But for now, thank you for listening to my second wind story. And I want to again highlight my Auntie Anne because what I'm doing is just giving her credit for the sacrifices that were made. And up until now, 80 years later, the story has remained completely silent and not in our history books. But it's worth saying and it's worth honoring the sacrifices of everyone. So, again, thank you for listening. I will check in with you next time, and you have a great second wind. Thank you for listening.